Okay. Well, so today I'm going to be talking with Soeren Eberhardt about his career in localization and internationalization and sort of the field, where it is and where it's going. Um, do you think you could explain really quickly a little bit about your field?
So the field, and since I'm also teaching localization, I have to explain it a lot to people who want to join the industry. Very shortly, it's basically adapting a digital product to a specific market. So the locale in localization actually stands for locale, meaning a combination of language and market. So when you think of Canada, you cannot just localize into Canadian. You have to go with English Canada, French Canada, maybe possibly even Inuktitut Canada, and kind of that specific combination is a locale, and that's what you adapt a product to. And with digital product, I mean software, services, websites, all those things. So sometimes, like in the early days, people would also add manuals to that, but there's not really a whole lot of printed documentation these days anymore. And as you could see, translation plays a role there, often a critical role. When I mentioned French Canada, obviously you need to translate when you're starting with English, but you can also have an adaptation for English Canada, where you might need on a web page, you might have legal disclaimers. People want to see their prices in the local currency, also with the right number format and so on. So that is really very shortly localization.
It's interesting. I like that you bring up that it's not just translation, because I think there's a temptation to think localization. So like you're a translator, right? Yeah, I bet you get that before. You've gotten that before, right?
Yes, and I try to give people some good examples about how, like, even for English. Actually, I'm working on the web pages now where Microsoft sells Microsoft 365. And I have a lot of work with Australia and the UK and Canada to really make sure that we do the web pages right. And yeah, that's all. Sometimes people also refer to that as marketization when you even adjust the design. But a lot of it is just the mere localization work that comes with adapting to another market.
So what kind of tasks do you do like every day in your job?
Fortunately, I don't have a boring job, so I cannot really talk a whole lot about repeated tasks. I would say I am connecting the dots. There's lots of different stakeholders that I work with. So in my specific case, I mentioned that I'm working on marketing websites. So I work together with marketing people who have an overall strategy, both in the headquarters and also in the subsidiaries, because they might have different approaches. So I might get input from the Japanese subsidiary because they are running a specific campaign that they want to have on our pages. And I need to, very often I just need to really connect the dots between all these different stakeholders and make sure that we're doing the best thing for the international customers. That is basically my main task, is really making sure that something that has been developed, yes, with the world in mind, but often with a pretty specific US perspective, making sure that that lands well worldwide and whatever changes need to be made there. So the mere translation aspect is pretty operationalized. I don't need to worry too much about that, but I need to worry a lot about what campaigns might really work in a certain market. How might we cater for specific emerging markets? What do we do if in Argentina there's a new law about credit cards? How do we put that on the webpage, and so on? So it is always different tasks, but it's a lot of looking at the international customer, consuming a lot of data, doing some research as well, and then making sure that the operations that we do with our vendor implement all these things that are specific markets.
So it's like a higher level kind of sewing everything together, more of a.
It is, yes.
And what do you think your favorite part of what you do is?
It is thinking about customers worldwide and constantly having to learn. I really love that learning aspect. I mean, the localization industry at large is a pretty new industry, and it has to evolve because there are new technologies for which we localize. So just think about like voice assistants. These days, I cannot say the one that Amazon sells because then the device in this room will ask me what I want. Like Siri, Cortana, and so on. If they tell you a joke, those jokes have been written specifically for market. So that was actually a localization task. A lot of the other stuff is more natural language processing, the input and all that. But that is an area of localization that didn't exist a few years back. And there's always something new coming up in terms of technology. On the other hand, there's the technology in the localization industry as well. Like when I started many years back, translation memories were a fairly new thing. And a lot of that technology has been established, but then machine translation became important. And with machine translation moved from rule-based to statistical to neural machine translation. And so all these changes have constantly forced us to adapt. And I have to say that I really like being forced to learn every day and look around and see, what changes are happening, where should we make changes to keep up.
It keeps you on your toes every day.
Yes, indeed.
So if there were one thing that you could avoid in your day-to-day or that you do regularly, because I guess you say you don't do anything every day, but if there were something that you could avoid that you do semi-regularly, what do you think it would be?
Well, the one thing that I would like to avoid is I love meetings when they're productive, but it's hard in the localization industry. You often have stakeholders all over the world. And actually, I just got off the phone with my coworker in Beijing, and we only have a specific time window. So the one thing that I would like to avoid is the existence of time zones. But I think not everybody will agree that they all go on Pacific time.
Yeah, well, that's understandable, I guess. So you touched on this next thing I wanted to ask you about a little bit. You talked about how the industry has changed quite a bit, and you've got, translation as a subcomponent of what you work with. It's gone from it's now sort of neural translation. It used to be statistical, and but what in the sorts of tasks that you do regularly has changed? Has any of that changed as opposed to just the technology?
Yes, I would say that project management used to be a lot more important. Kind of that translation pipeline, you get a source text, source strings, and getting those to a translator and then coming back with some validation, especially for software, you need some additional validation. A lot of that has become really operationalized. And I like that because I feel like there was not a whole lot of value add for people taking files and distributing them to lots of different translators. A lot of those things are fairly automatic these days. And that is definitely a big change. So for what I'm doing now, like 10 years ago, I would have probably had to be a lot more on, where are those files? Are they now with a vendor? And even at that time, the vendor then would have had a project manager who would have distributed the files. So these days, things have become a lot faster. So it's not that we have like big sets of files that we send out to people anymore. It's basically string by string. But all that goes really fast. I get strings back within a day from translators, and I don't really have to worry about it. It's not that I think about handoffs and handbacks. So when you talk to veterans in the industry, they will use those terms. And people when you're just like, yeah, those things just flow and they come back. And I think that's the way that it should be. I think it's a really good change.
Do you think that's because people have gotten more used to dealing with localization than they used to be, or is it the technology that's better, or what?
I would say part of it is definitely the technology, but it couldn't have been done without basically those people who are developing the products and that source language. They also need to be aware of what they have to do. So, and that is always part of the work of localization teams. Um, some companies are better in, they have much more experience in localization. I would say like the big IT companies in the US are definitely very, very strong in that, that also developers will learn about it very early on. For some smaller companies, it's probably harder. And so the localization teams, they are probably more challenged to educate and educate and educate and make sure that things are not only localizable, but also properly globalized, internationalized, that you can really show different date formats and all these things without somebody finding that issue very late in the localized product.
Okay. So more dealing with you personally, why did you choose to get into the field of localization and internationalization?
I did not choose to go there. I had no idea that the field existed. So I've been in localization for 25 years. And actually, it all started out because I was the go-to person for a lot of my friends when they were writing their master thesis. Can you proofread this and also make sure that it's stylistically okay? And I was their copy editor for lots of friends. And after I had done that for a while, a friend of mine approached me and said, "Oh, I just got this job offer. Somebody said, asked me whether I could be their copy editor for some translated texts." And I said, "No, I don't really like that kind of stuff, but I know that you've been doing such a good job." So I started as a copy editor for German translations. It happened to be a Microsoft product. So I worked for one of the vendors of Microsoft at the time, and it was printed material. So it was proofreading, translation, that eventually I figured, you know what, I've always loved English and I can actually translate myself. So I started translating, and then I worked in a company where they're also localizing software, and I had to get used to that at first as well. I remember my first HTML page. I had no idea what HTML was. I removed all the tags until the engineer sitting next to me said, "What are you doing there?" The text was translated well, I think, but yeah, it was everything was broken, so I had to redo that work, and the tools were not as good as they are today. So, and I slowly went from copy editor to translator. I was a linguistic lead, and then eventually I became a project manager, and then moved away from my native language, and I've been doing language independent work for a really long time now. But it was really, I did not even know that the whole industry existed. I had no idea. It was small at the time, but yeah, I was not aware. And I discovered that I really, really liked that work. So I've been sticking with it.
So it was sort of a baptism by fire kind of thing, like just thrown into it.
Yes, yeah, there was not a whole lot of training available. And that's one of the reasons why I really like, I teach localization courses now, and I really enjoy doing that, because there are now more formalized approaches available for people to learn about the field.
So that's a really good segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. What kind of formal education should somebody have if you want to go into localization?
So yes, there's a few courses available, and I'm more aware of what's going on in the US. I mean, there's the Monterey Institute. There's at the University of Washington, where I'm teaching. There's a localization program consisting of 3 courses. And I know that's different programs all over the States, and increasingly so, I think, also in Europe. Still, I think too few. But the good thing is that a lot of those courses are now available online. For people who just want to get a first glimpse at it, I also helped create an edX course that you can just audit. So if people really completely unfamiliar with localization and they want to get a feel for what the field entails, I think that's a good approach. I think that Google also has some localization material online. So there's a few things that you can do as a first stage. And then I would say, if you have a chance to attend a localization program, so yeah, I've been connected with a lot of my students, and they've been actually pretty successful. A lot of them have gone into the language industry. Actually, one of my former students is co-teaching with me now, so
Oh,
that's
wow.
definitely a success story. So, yeah, yeah. But there's not a whole lot of literature out there, so I think it still is attending classes, and
Mhm.
yeah, there's not really a whole lot of localization for dummies available.
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess. Well, you should send me the link to that edX course though afterwards. So I'd be
Yes.
interested to look at that. Do you have any advice as to like sort of informal education or soft skills that would be important for people to sort of get if they want to get into the localization industry?
Um, so for informal education, I would say there's a lot of networking events in the
Hmm.
localization industry. There are things like Lock Lunch, and so somebody who's just starting in the industry, they should just try to find out, are there meetups in their area. Well, right now it's not the best time to meet in person, but some of those things are online already, and hopefully things change. So
Hmm.
um, there's definitely that opportunity of networking, and then finding people who you might be able to talk to about certain areas even more. In terms of soft skills, I would say that it's probably true for a lot of industries, that communication skills have gotten so important, and collaboration skills.
Hmm.
And I'm wisely hiding my introvert character, but I've worked on that. So I've come out of that introvert shell, um, and I practice just doing small
Hmm.
talk with people, and well, now I don't have problems teaching a class anymore. But I would say that people should work on their communication skills, and working with others. I think those are super important soft skills. As I said, probably in many industries, but more so even in localization, where you have the more technical side, you have the language side, and if you're a program manager or project manager, you often have to combine
Hmm.
bring all these different sides together. But even if you're just an engineer, you might have to work. Well, you will have to work then with the PMs and so on. So there's
Hmm.
that communication piece is always relevant.
Okay, that makes, I think, a lot of intuitive sense, especially with a field like localization, because it's sort of multidisciplinary, and your whole job is communicating essentially. So
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Well, so you've already hit on sort of the next kind of set of things I wanted to talk about, but in terms of resources, is there anything you go to if you want to like improve, or if you have a problem you're not sure how to solve? Is there any kind of resource that you use in your um, regular sort of performance of duties?
That's a tough one for things where I need to figure out how to do something. I haven't really seen the good how-to guides. I think I would often go and talk to people if
Hmm.
I have a specific problem where I really don't know how to approach that. Um, I would say that one way of learning, there's some good industry organizations. Unfortunately, some of them, they will offer their webinars only
Hmm.
to paying members, while you can also pay for that individual webinar, but that might be a little expensive when you're
Yeah.
just starting out. But they've increasingly, especially over the last year, there have been free conferences, and I think that's definitely something worthwhile. There was so often actually the providers of CAT tools will
Hmm.
have these conferences where and they will not only talk about CAT tools, they will talk about lots of different aspects of localization. And that is a
Hmm.
good resource. Yeah, I would look at, um, I don't have a full list of links in my head, but there are
No, no, that's
podcasts.
fine.
Um, there's great blogs. I know that some of the big LSPs have their blogs, and just keeping an eye on the topics that interest you. I think those are really good resources to get you started and understand certain processes, like what does subtitling
Hmm.
entail, and then trying to figure out, is there a specific podcast on that. Um, or is there a specific log entry by one of those LSPs?
So sort of more, you have to talk to people. You can't just hole yourself up and read a bunch of books on it. You gotta find other people.
Yeah, well, I would say
is
that
sort of what you're.
Well, some of the resources, I mean, those conferences, you can just sit there and listen in. You will always get more out of it if you can ask a question and they address that. But there's a lot of content also that you can consume passively. You just need to find the right,
sort
right
of outlet.
there.
So one sort of last thing on skills and how to learn stuff. If you were to suggest to somebody that they get, or suggest to somebody 3 skills that they could gain or learn that are not directly related to localization, what would they be? 3 skills that would help them in the field but aren't directly part of localization?
Well, I already talked about the small talk, right?
Yeah,
to
I
be
guess
able to do your communication. But so aside from that, I think that one of the things that's super helpful for people, ultimately, you deliver localization, you deliver localized products for people in different markets. So just understanding your customers, I think, is super important. And I think you cannot understand how different people all over the world are if you don't travel, if you never leave your home country. I think that traveling is really helpful. And unfortunately, nobody can travel to all those countries that we provide products for, even if you only have 10 markets, right? It would be a lot, but just getting a glimpse of how different people can even use the same product that is made for one specific purpose, but then they bend it to their needs. It can be super, super interesting to see that. And you don't even need to do usability studies. Sometimes it's just looking at how people think differently, how people live differently. Sometimes think that this whole idea of, the whole world got so globalized and the whole world got so westernized. There's truth to it to a certain degree, but then people still live very differently. And I mean, even within a country as big as the United States, you have kind of different regional cultures. Even we are not all the same, right? And then there's the individual level as well. So just understanding that customers can have very, very different approaches, and doing that through traveling, I think that's one of the things that I would always recommend. And I yet have to meet somebody in the localization industry who doesn't like to travel. I think that's kind of, it's one of those things that when people are drawn to the industry, that they're also just like that experience of difference. You wanted three related skills from me.
Yeah, well, you've given me kind of 2, the communication, travel. If you have
I
another
feel
one,
that
great.
I would always say that willingness to learn. So at Microsoft, we call that the open mindset. Always assuming that you're only assuming. You don't know things. If you feel like you're the smartest in the room, you're doing something wrong. You should always feel that there's another question that you can ask, especially in something like localization. When you're serving different markets, there will be things that you don't know, and just keep that curiosity. And as I said, like the field is developing constantly. And so you cannot stand still. So bring that with you. And that's another skill where I would say that's important for many industries. A lot of things are changing. And if you enjoy learning, that's not an issue. So yeah, just challenge yourself, keep learning.
Are there any changes in the field of localization that you see that are not positive, or you think it's generally moving towards a better spot?
That is a tough question. I would say that there's never change that cannot have some negative side effects. I mean, I mentioned machine translation. So some of the regular tasks of translators will go away as machine translation gets better. There will be other areas, and I think the translators don't need to fear for their jobs right now, but some of those repetitive tasks and kind of simple translation tasks might just go away. And so if I'm a translator, I'm probably not happy about that. But on the other hand, we probably got a lot of unemployed horses when the car got introduced, and they found other ways to survive. Well, I don't know about all the horses, but ultimately, I think there's it can affect people, especially if they don't evolve. I think that for a translator who does evolve and thinks more about like specialization, the impact will not be net negative. But I do think that there's always a little bit, the more localization work is being done, the more you also run into danger that some things might be lower quality. You actively need to steer against that. But overall, I would say that, I mean, ultimately, it's an industry that's trying to build bridges between cultures and markets. And I think that's a really old challenge. That's something that the first translators had to do. And that's been something that has been around for a really, really long time. I think there's a constant there. I think that humans will never all speak the same language. I mean, even the UK and the US, two countries separated by the same language, but even there you sometimes need to have that translation aspect. As I said, and localization is more than just a mere translation. So I think that as an industry, I feel like all the progress, like the progress overall, is definitely a good thing.
So just one last thing to ask you, as sort of a question I ask in all the interviews I do. If you had one final piece of advice to give to somebody who's entering in your field, the fields of localization and internationalization, to sort of sum it up, what would you say?
Wow.
Kind of open-ended, but
it is very open-ended. I'm just looking, like because I took a few notes for so for somebody in the field,
somebody who is considering getting into the field, who wants to get into the field of localization.
I would just well, I feel like I've already given quite a bit of advice of the things that you can do to prepare yourself. I feel like the networking aspect is pretty important. Try to get to know people, because there are so many things that can change. Like reading up on one area that might change fairly quickly. Stay open-minded. Be curious. Yeah, there's a lot of things that sound pretty generic. I would say
that's good. That's interesting.
Well, but bring your passion. I mean, when I was talking about the industry at large, kind of that bridging cultures, I think just bring your passion for that. It's a great. I think it's a great problem to have, that humankind is diverse, but then also it's a cool challenge then to try to work with that for making a piece of software usable for millions, if not even billions of people worldwide. And yeah, doing the best that you can do for a specific web page that's usable for people worldwide. So I think, yeah, just be ready for that challenge and enjoy it.
Okay, that's that last part I think is really interesting that you talked about. Enjoy it because it's a cool problem to have. It's a cool problem that we have. I think in a lot of industries, the problems that we have aren't ones we really want to have. Like if you're a doctor, you're treating people who are sick. That's not a cool problem to have. We have it, but that's kind of a cool. It's a nice sort of outlook. It's a fun industry but we like the problem and the solution at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's a nice summary.
Well, thanks for agreeing to sit down and talk to me. I'm sure you're it's late there and you're ready to get off of Zoom and jump in bed. But thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk to me. Is there anything else you wanted to say, or are you sick and tired of me?
No, I love that you're doing these interviews. So now I can watch a few of them because I didn't want to be biased.